Hi everyone, welcome to this PEFM seminar. I'm Kalypso Nicolaidis, very glad and honored to share in the name of all my wonderful colleagues from PEFM and Charles Enoch, the current director, this seminar today. Especially happy because we are welcoming Adrienne Cheasty, who is known to many of you by now, although we were just talking and I was reminded that she's only been here for 6 weeks and it feels like she's already part of the Oxford European Centre family, very much so. And you've already been a wonderful citizen. Indeed, Adrienne is not foreign to academia. She's taught before at Harvard, Yale and Johns Hopkins, but she comes to us from the world of practice. Indeed, from the IMF, where she was deputy director of the Fiscal Affairs Department, working a lot on Europe, previously having worked on Western Hemisphere, Mexico, Venezuela, Andean countries and Caribbean, as well as emerging market and fragile states before that, and of having represented both her institution, the IMF, and herself in countless boards and organizations, including the World Economic Forum Global's Agenda Council on Fiscal Sustainability and on Public Finance and Social Protection. It's a mouthful, but it shows actually the width of all the issues that you've been interested in and working on while at the IMF. And now you've come to us, Adrienne, to really reflect back on a lot of what you've done previously, but also look forward in trying to kind of deepen some of the research that you started at the IMF and using kind of being with us at Oxford and within the context of PEFM to enhance your own, but above all ours too, understanding of these issues. Talking to us today about the Euro area's architecture. And I love the title about viability because we all care about sustainability. There is nothing more important than that. Prerequisites for a viable fiscal arm. And I think it's important to stress that this is research in progress. So it's actually the most fun for people like us when we listen to research in progress, because the signal is, tell me, react, tell me where I should go, what I'm doing. So we're very much looking forward to hearing you, Adrienne. Thank you for being with us.
Kalypso, thank you very much. As you know well, without Kalypso I wouldn't be here. So I'm very grateful for the invitation to St. Antony's and the possibility of continuing this work that I started in the IMF. Now, let me start by saying I got a really bad cold and my voice is low anyway. So if you're not hearing me, wave at me or shout, because I know that today's a day I need to make a particular effort. So, I'm going to talk about ongoing efforts to strengthen euro area architecture, and in particular the fiscal arm. Remember that there were 3 gaps in the architecture were identified as problems that needed to be resolved so there wouldn't be another crisis. Capital Markets Union, Banking Union, and Fiscal Union. So I'm going to talk about where we're going with this third it was a pillar, now it's an arm. I think maybe we should go back to being a pillar, but the third gap in the architecture. So let me make sure. This is what I'm going to talk about. First, I'm going to remind you why we need an effective fiscal arm. Secondly, I'm going to dwell for a couple of minutes on this miracle that happened in December, which was that heads of state, I think a bit contrary to expectations, instructed the Commission to go ahead with developing a budgetary instrument by June 2019. In other words, to go ahead with the fiscal arm. And then I'm going to discuss the characteristics that we would want this fiscal arm to have. I'm going to do this by reference to an exercise that a team that I supervised carried out in the IMF last year, where we set ourselves the challenge of designing a stabilization system that actually would deliver what euro area architecture needs. And so I'm going to go through that exercise, I hope fairly fast, because it's meant this isn't meant to be a presentation on the exercise, but it's meant to give you the exercise as a reference point for discussing what the Euro Summit budget should deliver. I'm going to look at the mechanism we used. I'm going to talk about the importance of size in achieving anything and describe the package that we came up with as a benchmark for the Euro budget. And then this gives us a basis for comparing the two. Our, if you like, ivory tower, unconstrained analytical exercise and where the budget is today, or where I think it's going. I want to talk a little bit about institutional arrangements because now I'm in academia and I can talk about this. It's a bit too non-economic and political for the IMF. And then finish with recommendations of where I think the budget should be going. This is the motivation. I guess I should say apologies because I know you've seen this slide, some version of this slide 1,000 times by now, anyone who's working on Euro area issues. It shows what happens when countries weren't able to use fiscal stabilization to support growth. So when growth collapsed in the crisis, I picked 2013 just because it happened to be a year where you can see everything very clearly. Growth collapsed and fiscal policy became very pro-cyclical because countries had to reduce their expenditure to offset the loss in tax revenue. The fiscal consolidation worsened growth. As structural balances were tightened, growth declined, and the countries that needed the growth most, let's say Greece, Portugal, Italy, were the countries that where fiscal policy was least supportive. So the conclusion from that was not that the crisis was in all cases a fiscal crisis, but the lack of support of a fiscal arm made the crisis much worse than it would have been. And therefore, a stabilization capacity was needed to avoid a new crisis. So, as I said, it was the fiscal arm was identified as one of the three arms that were needed, but it's so politically difficult that it wasn't clear whether it would be taken forward. And but in December at the Euro Summit, the instruction was quite clear from heads of state. Let me identify some of the key features. So first, the objectives. The objectives are not only a budget for stabilization. It's not a stabilization arm. It's a budget for convergence and competitiveness of the euro area. Secondly, it'll be part of the European Union budget. I'm going to come back to this later. It seems logical, but it's not a given, and it'll raise some challenges. Third, the size of the budget is to be determined. And again, this will be very political, but I want to show you that the IMF exercise worked a lot on the size that would be needed for a budget to be useful in stabilization. Finally, there's a deadline. This is quite soon. In June this year, that's why I'm doing this presentation now, because it's important to send a message of the characteristics that are needed for the budget. And then finally it says the instrument will be adopted in accordance with legislative procedures. I imagine this will raise a lot of issues about what needs to be changed in treaties and could be quite a long process, but I'm leaving that aside because I'm an economist and I don't know the legal side of things. So now let's switch gear to the IMF exercise. At the time we started the exercise, there was huge doubt about whether you could ever design a stabilization capacity that could achieve anything. All of you who've been working in the area know the arguments. A lot of people felt that solving the financial problems, banking union and capital markets union would be enough and you wouldn't need a fiscal arm. Others felt that any fiscal arm would be too expensive and you would never be able to get countries to put in the money that would be needed to get it going. Others were worried that it wouldn't be politically feasible. This issue of countries would end up being good countries or bad countries. Some countries would receive transfers forever, and some countries would have to contribute forever. And therefore, setting up a stabilization mechanism would be dangerous. It would be divisive and explosive. And then this issue of, again, worrying about good countries versus bad countries. If you offered a new instrument to bad countries, would this increase moral hazard? And how would you design an instrument that was perceived as fair and avoid creating another arena for disputes about the European budget? So we simply asked the question, could we design a central fiscal capacity that would achieve a worthwhile amount of stabilization, that would be affordable, while ruling out permanent transfers, avoiding moral hazards, and being completely fair? And the way we did that was quite formally. We set up a model of a stabilization capacity, just a pure stabilization capacity. We put it in the IMF's big multi-country model, and we tested how much stabilization you could get with this stabilization capacity. Then we did a zillion stress tests and used the stress tests to tell us what combination of parameters in the stabilization capacity would generate a stabilization fund that wouldn't explode, that wouldn't degenerate into some people giving contributions forever and some people receiving transfers forever. So I don't want to spend too much time on the mechanism itself, but I think I need to mention the characteristics. And please go to the paper for the more technical side of things. What we designed was a pure stabilization fund. All it did was receive contributions from countries in good times and pass them on to countries in bad times. This is what we call a rainy day fund. The transfers, for the sake of purity, the transfers were unearmarked. They weren't allocated to any specific expenditure, not to investment, not to unemployment insurance. The instruction was that countries would use the transfers to support their medium-term fiscal plans. And the transfers were final. Unlike other mechanisms that are being discussed in the literature at the moment, this is not a lending borrowing scheme. Once countries got the money from the stabilization fund, they would never have to pay it back. Other characteristics that we spent a lot of time on, but they're kind of it gets very niggly. There is an automatic trigger. The question is, how do you decide who's entitled to the transfer? And you do in our stabilization fund. There's a rule that says you become entitled to the transfer when your unemployment rate deviates from its 7-year moving average. So it's a normalized proxy for a worsening output gap. And finally, our stabilization fund has a borrowing capacity with a lot of footnotes saying you can use the borrowing capacity only in extreme circumstances. Oh, one thing I should note is to draw your attention to the function of two of the characteristics of the fund. The fact that it's final transfers rather than a lending borrowing scheme. One of the things we've realized in the IMF is that the gain from a lending borrowing scheme is much less because countries' debt keeps going up as they get transfers that they have to pay back, and so the markets can see that. They can see that the debt problem is not being resolved; it's getting worse. So it's quite important and this is a big deal for the other people that we were consulting with, because a big part of the profession is in favor of a lending borrowing scheme for this stabilization fund. But for us, final transfers are a credibility enhancer. And the other credibility enhancer is the borrowing capacity. Now, it puts people off a bit when to describe it as the fiscal version of whatever it takes. But whatever it takes on the monetary side was so important for maintaining the credibility of the euro area at the end of the crisis, that if one would have the same type of mechanism signaling that the whole weight of the euro area is behind the stabilization fund. However, one would not like that to be too generous a borrowing capacity. So the idea would be that the stabilization fund could borrow, but only if there were another general crisis.
Am I allowed to ask just a clarifying question? This borrowing and lending, would it be the euro area as a whole or the individual countries that have that possibility?
When we talk about a borrowing lending facility, it would be the euro area as a whole, yeah.
But how would it be distributed between the countries?
So the stabilization, in these models, the stabilization fund is a sort of a financial facility. And it could borrow, let's say it needed to transfer more to countries than the contributions it was getting in. It could borrow from the markets, but it would be the euro area borrowing. But that's why, lots of countries don't like that, the idea of the euro area borrowing. So every time one mentions adding a characteristic like this into the fiscal arm, one has to tread carefully. We came to the conclusion that it's really necessary. You need whatever it takes on the fiscal side, but you need to caveat it quite a lot. So this is the exercise we did. The question is, once you have the structure of the stabilization fund, how big would contributions need to be, how big would transfers need to be, and how much stabilization could you get? In other words, how expensive would it be, what would it give countries once the money was paid into it, and how useful would it be for solving the problems of stabilization that weren't solved in the last crisis?
Can you tell us what those vertical axis numbers are? So I'm just wanting to scale how big or small it is.
Whoops, I'm really sorry. It's got caught in all I've done. They're percent of GDP.
But I have no idea how much.
No, I realize that's quite a problem. So to cut to the chase, the blue line is the baseline stabilization fund that we ended up with, that ended up cycling around equilibrium, and the contribution that you need to, the chart is on transfers. No, I'm going to go back to, so the contribution that you need to generate enough transfers to stabilize, but not for the system not to explode, is 0.35% of GDP. And the transfers over time use up the 0.35% of GDP. So they use it up in bad times, they pay it back in good times. So by looking for a system that stays stable, we were able to generate a fund where the contributions and the transfers were essentially balanced given the different characteristics of the countries as modeled in our model, and the system didn't explode. I put this chart up not for you to look at, but just to tell you that we'd done the work. The chart shows that we checked for every country both contributions and transfers in order to see that it doesn't explode. It would help if I had longer period charts, so that you could be convinced that all of the lines that may look as if they're exploding are actually turning down at some point. But this is just to show you the kind of exercise we were doing to make sure we had a viable system.
But you're saying all countries, I mean, Germany is always under zero, for instance. Well, except the red line, but with the blue and the black.
Well, what's interesting, and you can't see, and we did agonize about this, and I wouldn't, I'd hate you to quiz me on the specifics, but because Germany is so big, and the fact that there was a period when Germany needed to use it, Germany would have been quite a significant user in terms of the size of the fund at one stage.
Mm-hmm.
And now obviously an exercise like this is very dependent on the historical data that you have. If you go back the simulations we were doing were based on, I think, going back to 91. And one has to be careful that one isn't generalizing too much from a specific set of data. But we knew that this exercise had to be approximate. In general, we thought we were doing the best, and I must admit, we were kind of thrilled when we found a system that didn't explode and that did generate quite a lot of stabilization.
Could you give us, maybe that's the answer to my question.
I'm hoping this is the answer to your question. That what this shows is the allocation of transfers that would have been able to be drawn from the fund. And again, blue is the baseline that we ended up using, where the system doesn't explode. This needs to be done in conjunction with getting the right formula for transfers. But given the right formula for transfers, during the crisis, on average, countries would have got 1% of GDP for them to spend to support their fiscal policy in 2013. And the countries that were hardest hit during the crisis would have got on average 2.5% of GDP to support spending from between 2009 and 2013. So really quite a lot. It's hard to see.
So can you explain what does 0.75 and 0.5 and 0.25 correspond to?
So,
It's the percentage of GDP that would have...
The stabilization fund has two sides, contributions in, transfers out. The issue is, how do you determine what transfers go out? The transfers that go out are functions of the deviation of the unemployment rate from its 7-year moving average. And then the question is, well, how much, let's say your unemployment rate hit the trigger. So, oh no, you're in recession, you need a transfer. How much transfer do you get? You get a multiple of the amount the unemployment rate has changed. And the multiple is 0.5%. The baseline multiple that we ended up with is 0.5% of GDP.
The blue one.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm spending too much time on this because it isn't really the point.
It's important that we understand, at least I'm sure everyone else understands, but I need to be clear on what it is. Yeah.
What we ended up, no, let me go back for 1 minute. So we ended up with a system where if countries paid in 0.35% of GDP, 0.33% of GDP, and transfers were allocated in response to shocks to unemployment at a rate of 0.5% of GDP, then the system would remain viable. It would cycle rather than exploding, and you'd achieve significant stabilization. Now, significant stabilization is not great. There's no problem anymore. Even with this system, which is kind of technically viable, we found that we could stabilize in good times, which is kind of irrelevant to this exercise. We would have stabilized 1/3 of any shock, and in the context what we're looking at now, where monetary policy is constrained and interest rates are hitting the zero lower band after the crisis, fiscal policy was more needed, and having the right fiscal policy would have stabilized up to 3/5 of the type of shock that we had in the euro area crisis. So quite a lot of stabilization, although no panacea. It's not as if countries could have coasted saying the euro area will bail us out, but the euro area with the right stabilization function could have materially mitigated the crisis. So this is just the summary of everything that I've been saying. We believed we came up with a viable package. In fact, we believe we came up with, in a way, the ideal package, the best possible package, because of our preconditions. So if every country on the revenue side contributed 0.35% of GDP every year, and I'm choosing the words carefully here because this is a conclusion that's full of caveats. Historical evidence suggests that the stabilization fund that was sustainable could be constructed with little likelihood of permanent transfers or needing to borrow, meaning wouldn't explode. And in this case, it could have paid quite important revenue replacing transfers, with hardest hit countries getting quite a lot. 2.5% of GDP would have been a lot. And if they had received these transfers under our design of a stabilization capacity, they would have been able to offset around more than half of the shock that they suffered during the crisis. So this was the exercise that we set ourselves. Is there a mechanism that would allow this much stabilization, and would it be affordable? It's debatable whether 0.35% of GDP from countries is affordable, but certainly it's reassuring that you could have offset more than half of the shock for an annual fee payment of 0.35% of GDP.
I'm terribly sorry. The shocks, what are they actually? I mean, you told us it's the average level of unemployment over 7 years and so on. So are these labour market shocks or what have you? Because the first thing I would think about is that the shocks are terribly endogenous towards the rest of the system, including fiscal transfers and taxes.
No, of course you're right, and I should have spent more time on this. I was trying to go fast. The simulation, the IMF model, and then the historical simulations that we did, both with the model and separate from the model because we couldn't do it all within the model, took the historical data, including the euro area crisis, and applied it as if the stabilization capacity had existed throughout that period. So the shocks are really stylized, but the shocks are the shocks that happened, except stylized.
And you're offsetting the 3/5 of the shock. You've got the 0.35%. That's each. I mean, that's building up over time, presumably.
Yes, exactly.
So
there
how
are issues
many
that
years do you have to
there
run
are
it
issues that
before-
I'm not getting into about. Obviously, it matters when you start.
Yeah.
So in this case, with the exercise, this finding of
You assume you've been running it for years.
assume you've been running it, that it's ready to go.
Right.
Now, either it's been running for years, or you say we can borrow, now is the right time to borrow because we're in a crisis. But we're going to function.
As though you had a stock.
Yes, exactly.
Does the model take into account the dynamic effects of increased growth thanks to the 3/5 offsetting and therefore increased fiscal capacity, including for countries that are able to export, etc., etc.? I mean, all these dynamic
yes,
effects.
it does. It's. Now I have to be careful because I'm not. I would need to ask you exactly what you're getting at to say that the model really does. But the model is a dynamic general equilibrium model, so it solves everything at the same time. And in fact, the IMF was quite. I think one could do the same kind of exercise in a very simple way, but one wouldn't get the sort of second round, third round effects of the impact on growth and employment, and then the feedback to the fiscal.
On other countries, not the ones
Yes,
who get the transfer,
including-
but
including
the other countries.
including spillovers.
Yeah.
There's a whole another angle to this that I didn't get into, where we look at the spillovers and the spillbacks, and all of those are supposedly in a very stylized way with lots of caveats taken into account.
Just a final summary, 0.35 is big enough contribution to ensure that there's that stabilisation and
Yes.
the system doesn't explode.
Yes.
But if the next crisis is twice as big as the last one, then 0.35 would explode
Or not stabilised.
or not stabilise.
Yes, if the next crisis were twice as big,
And lasted twice as long.
you'd need to borrow.
Yeah, right.
And then the question is whether you'd ever go back.
Yeah.
And we can't answer that because
Sure.
the exercise that we did just used historical data. So we're not pretending that this is, you know, a completely
Calibrated on
trustworthy
past
answer.
crisis, which is
But
rather than just being made up, and that's very useful.
exactly, and this was a terrible crisis. I mean, one would not expect, touch wood, this kind of crisis again, unless Britain were to leave the euro area or something like the euro. Okay.
I have a question on the borrowing capacity of the fund by, I assume, issuing some sort of Eurobond, but we can take it later because I sense you want to get on.
Well, I mean, if it's technical, it's actually better that we wrap our head around the model itself. If it's bigger questions, then we leave it for afterwards. But if it's specific,
The
that
technical question is the borrowing capacity of the fund, let's call it the stabilization fund, does that depend on the amount that is the net surplus, if you like, that's in the fund, so that if there are no crises, the size of the fund will increase
Yeah, exactly.
over time, and then presumably it can raise, I mean, it can issue a bond at a more attractive interest rate.
That's too far.
Yes.
Well, let me answer the first part of it, and let me say we didn't spend a lot of time talking about what kind of financial instruments it would use. Yes, the idea is that if you happen to start the stabilization fund in good times, years could go by and it would accumulate quite a lot of surplus, which would then be available without borrowing. So when a crisis hit, when the stabilization fund would need to borrow would kind of depend on when it started. But the functioning of the fund itself and the rule for getting transfers shouldn't depend on when it started, although it could. It just would have been, you know, building in some kind of transition
If it
path.
relates to my earlier sort of remark about who is doing the borrowing. I mean, if it's the whole of Europe, including Germany, it will get good terms anyway.
Oh, no, absolutely.
That really doesn't seem to me to be the problem.
Absolutely.
And the reason I was asking the previous question was if it was just Greece, then they might, you know, not be able to borrow. But this fund, if there's a proper Eurobond system, can do what it likes, really.
Absolutely. I mean, this is why it would be the fiscal whatever it takes, because it would be the power of the euro area. But in all the work we did, we tried to stay away from focusing on the borrowing capacity, which I'm failing miserably
and
at
especially
here.
since we've just uttered the word Eurobond, which we know is explosive politically. So it's afterwards, because we do want to let you finish, Adrienne. That's only fair. But we will also get into, you know, how do you sell this to especially the Germans, and what you call it, because Eurobond may not be the right idea, even if that's in part what it might be. But can we just hold that political question and have you go back to the slide on comparison?
Okay,
Yeah.
yes.
And then we'll have the discussion.
Okay, so finally, having successfully presented the model, I'm going to use the model to discuss where we are today, which is absolutely very far from the idealized IMF analytical model. So, let's see. So, first of all, the reason I wanted you to think about the model is because the model delivered what the euro area needs. At least we think so.
Yeah.
It delivered what we think is the best stabilization capacity.
It's magic.
And it's not magic. It was very painful, but it's magic because
Fiscal magic.
It's frictionless. We were able to assume away all the things that the euro budget hasn't been able to assume away, unfortunately, and that's the next part of the discussion. So, in terms of size, on the revenue side, the IMF stabilization capacity that achieved an adequate, a reasonable amount of stabilization required contributions of 0.35% of GDP per annum from countries. We don't have any idea yet, I think, although I'm not an insider and I'd really like to know if people are working on this with the Commission, how big they're envisaging the budget to be.
Does anyone know in this room?
I think it's the wrong question.
Well-
The big thing for an individual country is the automatic stabilisers. For sake of argument, they're about 50%. 50% is offset. If you and you don't want to borrow abroad if you're Greece, but you're actually borrowing as the eurozone as a whole, and it could be a very similar model, which just simply says, well, let the automatic stabilisers everywhere.
Okay, but that's
operate.
kind of like a different logic. So perhaps we'll come back to that, right? Because the issue of the size of the fund itself, of a specific dedicated budget, is exactly to go beyond automatic stabilization.
Yeah,
So-
exactly.
So, yeah.
Now, the only thing I
But-
would say, though, is that in theory, with the fiscal rules, a certain amount of automatic stabilizers
Yeah.
can work today.
Well, they're still the
So,
largest.
yes, and I have I'm jumping ahead, but I have a signaled 2/3 of the way down that it would be really good if we all changed the fiscal rules so that they were more satisfactory. But that's a whole other seminar. Okay, so back to the top of the comparison. I think a main message that I'd like you to take away from the seminar is this sense of size. For a stabilization capacity to have any hope of delivering anything worthwhile, it would want to be at least, and I'm going to argue more than, at 0.35% of GDP annual contributions by countries. Why? Because the IMF model was the sort of ideal model with no impediments to the functioning of the stabilization. And every real budget, as I'm going to discuss for the next couple of minutes, will have lots of frictions and lots of problems that reduce the amount of effective stabilization that it could generate. So the IMF stabilization capacity, remember how the transfers were used. The transfers could be used for anything. They simply replace lost revenue for governments. So the governments can spend it on whatever they were going to spend it on anyway. So there's no earmarking. This is an investment budget. This is unemployment insurance. This is for expanding defense. It's purely revenue replacement. Whereas the Euro Summit instruction envisaged a budget that would have programs for cohesion and competitiveness. So this is going to be a structural budget, a budget with programs that are decided in advance. The IMF stabilization capacity does all its spending at the bottom of at the low end of the cycle. So it never spends anything when it isn't achieving stabilization through the spending. Whereas, although the euro budget hasn't been specified, it's very unlikely that you would set up a budget and be able to say some years it won't spend anything. It'll only spend during the years when stabilization is needed. And finally, on stabilization capacity, the lag in disbursements of spending from the stabilization fund into the countries that need the money is only about a month, in the sense that unemployment data come out every month. It's high frequency data, and it doesn't get revised very much. It's fairly trustworthy. Whereas the lag in any structural budget is the lag that's built into the budget cycle, which is either 6 months or a year until you can revise the budget. Now it happens that all of these characteristics that are likely to be part of the Euro summit budget will reduce the amount of stabilization it can deliver compared with the pure idealized stabilization capacity that the IMF designed. So again, I'm coming back to this message of size, which may be whistling in the wind as regards what's really going to happen, but I think it's very important. If we want to develop a viable fiscal arm, it has to be big enough. 0.35% of GDP would be the minimum needed, with no frictions to stabilize 3/5 of a shock of the type that you had in the last crisis we had. So any budget that promises to solve the stabilization problem will need to be bigger than that, particularly if it has the characteristics of a structural Euro budget. Now, having said that, there are good things, I think, and then this becomes much more speculative because it's not comparing quantities and models anymore. There are good things about going the direction of the Euro summit budget. The IMF model solved this issue of, if we build discretion into the system, everyone will fight. By having an automatic trigger, so absolutely no discretion. Presumably, with the Euro summit budget, the whole budget will be designed from scratch. I think the idea is to build in an expanded defense mechanism, to look at refugee policy. Again, I don't know, I'm not an insider on this. I'm very interested to see what they'll come up with. So the question is whether choosing to go in this very opposite direction, where everything is discretionary and has to be designed from scratch, whether this is so contentious that it will never be resolved, or whether it's actually the right way to design a fiscal pillar for the euro area.
So it's just worth perhaps pointing out that we always use discretion in two ways: discretion for the EU as a whole, and then discretion for states receiving it. And in your model, you have no discretion for the EU, but you have full discretion for the country, since it's their national budget. They do whatever they want. And in the euro, it's the inverse. You have full discretion for the EU as a group, but the countries will have structural components, right? So they have less discretion. Yeah. So it's kind of the two types of discretion are inversed.
Yeah, that's actually really, sorry, that didn't occur to me. Yes, when I talk about discretion, it's the discretion at the level of, in this case, the Commission.
But it's interesting to see that it's inverse for the country.
No, that's. Let me figure out how to make that clearer. So, the reason that I like the idea of, and I've switched from trying to describe our model to being completely value-driven and speculative. I like the idea of a public goods budget because it shifts the debate about which country gets what to a debate which I think is a more positive debate, in which Europe needs, even if they don't feel they need it at the moment, which is what are the public goods that we need for the European project. And I think even if this is going to create a huge discussion if a budget of any significant size is floated, it's still a less divisive way for Europe to construct a fiscal arm. Now, again, this is just an opinion, and I'd be interested to hear what other people think. I had set up a number of questions about how do we solve political feasibility constraints. The last one was how do we solve the moral hazard problem. In a way, I don't think either the IMF stabilization capacity or the Euro summit budget have done anything that's very satisfying in that direction. We always come back to this issue of the fiscal rules would be more binding if they were simpler and better designed. And we said that in the IMF paper, and I think the Commission is saying the same thing. And as I said to somebody, that's a whole other seminar, what one would do to make the fiscal rules better. But the moral hazard problem tends to get solved that way. I had, in the IMF model, we discussed a stronger solution to the moral hazard problem of linking the stabilization capacity, which is your everyday putting in money, taking it out, a normal business, with the ESM reform programs. So if you spent too many years drawing money out of the stabilization fund and not putting anything in, maybe you should be thrown automatically into an ESM reform program. And that would have been a strong additional anti-moral hazard measure. But it was seen as too draconian, too centralist to be realistic. I had one slide here that I had meant to refer to in the middle of this slide, so let me go to it now, and then I'll toggle back. When we're talking about size, you may think I'm fixated on this 0.35% of GDP, but I want you to think of it in terms of where we are at the moment. The whole EU budget is 1% of GDP. So we would be, me saying, and you need 0.35% to have any hope of stabilization, it's to expand the current the existing budget by 1/3. So which is not implausible, although I have no idea whether it's on the cards. It's probably not. A point I wanted to make, though, is that once you get into saying we'll achieve stabilization by a certain type of public good, you run into the constraints of size. So we had a really interesting seminar a couple of weeks ago on expanding the defense budget as a stabilization instrument. So I was curious, I went to the budget to look at how much it would have needed to expand in order to contribute significantly to stabilization. The defense budget, the security budget, which is broader than defense, is only 2% of 1% of GDP. So it's 0.02% of GDP. So even if you doubled or quadrupled the defense budget, which goes beyond what we would think is likely to happen in the next couple of years, you wouldn't get very far towards meaningful stabilization, which is why the number crunchers like us tend to end up very quickly back with not public goods, with the big national programs like unemployment insurance or the pure stabilization approach that we took.
So you do have the two big chunks, right? The 35%, that's cohesion funds? 35%?
One of them is cohesion and the other is, frankly, agriculture. And
agriculture,
so, but...
Well, we don't want to increase the... Yeah. But cohesion does relate. There's a correlation, at least, with stabilization.
Oh no, absolutely.
So it's more interesting.
Oh, no, it's not.
Whereas security doesn't.
It's not that you couldn't do it, and I mean the budget is explicit on it. The instruction says competitiveness and cohesion. So it's something like 14% and 35%. So it's not that there aren't interesting programs in that couldn't be expanded. It's just that they all have rules. They would all have rules that weren't only let's spend at the right time to stabilize. So you would have the fact that some of them aren't very big, so even doubling them wouldn't bring you very far. You also have the fact that they can only be changed the next time you do the budget, and everyone has to agree. So what I'm saying is that a budget of this type doesn't very easily deliver the amount of stabilization that one would get through
course.
a stabilization
Mm.
capacity.
Mm.
I'm nearly finished. I can hear the bell tolling. Let me go back. Let me go forward. I wanted to talk for 2 minutes about the institutional arrangements. Where would you put the fiscal arm? I call it a central fiscal capacity. Sorry, I meant to change that. You could either put it in the EU budget, and the Commission, the Euro Summit was explicit about this. It will be in the EU budget, and there are benefits to that. You're ensuring that the same budget procedures can be used, consistency of other spending, and as I said, something I think is important, you're moving away from the question of which country gets what to a debate about what public goods Europe needs. And remember, the shortcoming of that is actually public goods in Europe don't take up a lot of fiscal space. The alternative would have been to put it in the ESM, and a branch of the people discussing the budget, the stabilization function, saw this as a better alternative. Now, the design would have been very, very different. It would have, the IMF stabilization function would have fitted in there, but most of the people envisaging putting it in the ESM were envisaging lending, borrowing, another financial instrument. If it had been in the ESM, there would have been no discretion, no budgetary function as part of the stabilization capacity. All spending decisions would remain with national governments, as opposed to being centralized now, which is the idea. You wouldn't have had any lag. And I come back to this point that actually you would have had possibly a stronger anti-moral hazard signal, because it would have been easier to move a country from, it might have been easier to move a country from abuse of the stabilization capacity into an ESM reform program, since the two would have been sitting next to each other institutionally. But that's very speculative again. Finally, conclusions from all of this, and this is a restatement really of what I've said. First thing is the reminder. When we set out to create a viable fiscal arm, it was because we need fiscal stabilization. Obviously, it's nice to have spending for cohesion and competitiveness, but it's saying that we'll have a budget that achieves cohesion and competitiveness is not necessarily the same as having an instrument that achieves adequate stabilization. So not to forget that that's the ultimate goal. For a successful stabilization capacity, the size of the budget matters. You could be way too small. So please, no matter what the designers of the Euro budget are thinking of, bear in mind that the expansion of the centralized fiscal capacity should be at least 0.35% of GDP, and I would argue more than that. If the proposals are for a much smaller expansion, the goal should be to tell the public that in the long term, if they want stabilization, they will need a bigger budget. Another point that I've mentioned over and over is that agility matters a lot. You won't have successful stabilization if you don't get the right resources to the right country at the right moment. In a context like this, earmarking of programs, pre-specifying them, and having a budget cycle that takes a year is going to hold up stabilization, which is your traditional message for fiscal policy, that it's not as agile a stabilizer as monetary policy because it moves so slowly. One thought which one would like to send to the Commission is, even if having a structural budget rules out the possibility of completely liquid transfers moving fluidly frictionlessly at the right time, you could nonetheless design the contributions so that the contributions follow this cycle, that they're paid in counter-cyclically, in good times and not bad. And that might be a fairly straightforward way of getting getting some of the stabilization that you could have got in the pure IMF system. Credibility matters. I possibly should have spent more time on this. for the markets, whether risk premia go up or not affects enormously the success of the stabilization policy, because it moves very quickly into interest rates, and a higher interest bill can offset any gain that you have by receiving transfers. So two things. One, it's good to have final transfers, and that's the idea, that's the plan in the Euro budget. And secondly, I recommend that they consider providing a borrowing capacity for the budget, and I have no idea whether they intend to or not, but let's have a fiscal whatever it takes built into this new budget. Finally, and this is unfinished business, minimizing disputes is a vital goal. The focus, shifting the debate from which country gets what to a focus on public goods is a strength of the Euro Summit instruction. On the other hand, we're waiting for a design that everyone can agree on about what the budget will actually look like, and we don't know how far we are from that. We also will have a difficult issue of what the euro area budget pays for and what the European community pays for, because in a lot of cases it's not clear why a public good should be in the euro area rather than in the European Union. And so that was my final thought, which is a very IMF policy message. The case for putting programs into the euro area budget as opposed to the European Union budget will have to be skillfully developed. So that's it. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Long.
No,
It was
you,
long, but
Adrienne,
it was
thank you
trying
first of all.